I'm David Plank. I'm Executive Director of Policy Analysis for California Education. For those of you who don't know PACE, PACE is a partnership between UC Berkeley, Stanford, and the University of Southern California. And we're very pleased today to partner with the Graduate School of Education here at UC Berkeley to co-sponsor this forum on whether Vergara will make a difference for California schools. And my job today is very simple. I'm going to introduce Judith Warren-Little, who is the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley. She's a longtime faculty member whose own work focuses on teachers' work and matters of teacher policy. And I will let her introduce the event.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. When we planned this event, we didn't know we would be competing both with a beautiful warm day and the 7th game of the World Series. So thank you all for being here. We were extremely pleased to recruit John Merrow as our moderator today. Many of you may know him as education correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. You may follow his blog, Taking Note, especially if you follow the Learning Matters website. He's president of Learning Matters, and they've produced, I think, now 30 documentaries, a number of print media of all sorts on the matters of education. John's an award-winning journalist whose career in education journalism began over 40 years ago. You can't possibly be that old. With National Public Radio. In 2012, he became the first journalist to receive the prestigious McGraw Prize in Education. His forays in education have taken him from kindergarten classrooms to community colleges and from teacher protests to the halls of the Capitol. He holds a doctorate in education and social policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, so he knows us well. I want to say just one more word about Learning Matters, because its mission is to, quote, encourage and enrich public dialogue about education, youth, and families. And so that's precisely what we're up to today. We're glad to have him here to help us enrich that dialogue. And just as a word in passing, John did not testify for either side in the case.
Thank you very much. Could I ask my panel to come up and join us on stage? And let's leave that last seat open for Linda. And just before, I'm going to sit down, because we want this to be as relaxed and action-packed as possible. It is a kick for me to be back here. 2 of my kids graduated from this institution. There will be comment cards handed out, but they are question cards. So if you have a question you want to throw to, please write the question down, and if you just hold the card up, someone will come pick it up and bring it up to me. We are going to try to cover policy, politics, and practice with this panel, and then with a second panel. Linda Darling-Hammond is coming over from Stanford to balance out the panel to Berkeley to Stanford. She'll just sneak right up and join us, I'm trusting. So all the way to the stage, that stage right? Katharine Strunk of Cal.
USC. USC.
Oh, I misread. It's not a balanced panel.
It's not a balanced panel.
and PACE. Okay. That William Koski of Stanford, but Stanford Law School with an appointment at the Ed School, and Naila Saud Nasir of Cal, which
yes.
Rossier. So I guess maybe we do have a kind of a balance. So let's find out first who supports this decision.
I do.
Okay. So we just find out. You support it. You do not support the decision. You do not support the decision. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I like parts of the decision and would change other parts of it.
So we have a balanced panel. But when Linda gets here, were you surprised, Katharine? Were you surprised by the decision?
I was surprised by the decision. I was surprised by a number of things. One of them was the brevity of the decision. The brevity of the decision.
Yeah.
It was a very short decision, and it was very strongly worded, and I was not used to seeing that in these kinds of decisions. So I was surprised that kind of the judge wholeheartedly adopted the plaintiff's.
Wholeheartedly. I mean, he cites Brown versus Board of Education in the first sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But you were surprised.
I was surprised at the extent to which he agreed with the plaintiffs.
Were you surprised?
I was surprised.
Angry?
Yes.
What was your emotional reaction?
Frustration, I think, because for me it just misses what are the core set of issues in terms of thinking about how we improve education. And so it feels like another step in what for me is kind of a misguided direction.
What was your reaction?
So it was mixed, as I said before, and the part that I wasn't particularly surprised about and was actually quite heartened by was the fact that the judge was willing to recognize that there is a qualitative component to the right to an education, and that you can look at equal protection law and decide, are some kids getting a high quality education and others not, and that should give rise to potential legal action. So I wasn't entirely surprised by that, because that is the natural progression of the law, in my view, in California based on the past cases. I was surprised, though, that the decision was so short. I was quite surprised that there weren't extensive findings of facts. In fact, the rhetoric of the decision suggested to me that there should have been a lot more in terms of findings of fact. Usually when you see a decision with that kind of language, there's a lot in the record and in the decision to show that kids are actually being quite deprived. Didn't see that, so I was surprised. We can talk later about the wisdom of courts getting involved with this kind of activity, but I was partially surprised and partially not surprised.
In the decision, he says he's going to avoid considering the political aspects of the case. Did he, in your judgment, avoid considering the political? I mean, he said, I know it's going to cause a political reaction, but he said, my job is to avoid considering.
I think he relied heavily on research that was presented during the trial, especially from the plaintiffs, but also some from the defense side. And as a result, I think he was able to step back and say, I'm not looking at the politics, I'm looking at the data. And so in that sense, he may have avoided political leanings simply by focusing so much on the evidence that he brought to bear in his statement.
So I would actually say that indicated, that the evidence of which we're speaking here indicated to me that he did bring a political lens to the decision on some level, in part because, at least again in the decision that we can see, he didn't go through the paces of articulating how these 4 or 5 employment statutes conspired to deny or conspired to keep any single teacher in a poor performing classroom, and how that single teacher had any direct and appreciable impact on any kid's right to an education, or even at the aggregate level, showing how these statutes had that kind of a disparate impact on particularly poor kids and kids of color and the like. And if he would have gone through that exercise, I would have said, wow, you're basing this on the data, you're basing this on the evidence. But because we didn't see that in the decision itself, perhaps somewhere in his mental calculus he got there, but because we didn't see it in the decision itself, I have to wonder, just taking Raj Chetty's information about, how having a poor performing teacher can affect your life's chances, and then having these 4 statutes and somehow making the logical leap from there to there, what was the connective tissue?
I don't think he just took Raj Chetty's study. Let's be fair. There were multiple studies presented in the case. Many of them were to do with layoffs. Many of them were to do with tenure. I mean, he did look at a number of different studies. Chetty's was definitely the most, had been promoted the most in the media, but there were multiple studies he used in his statement, as well as in the actual evidence provided in the trial.
Do you think he was, you mentioned the lack of the citations of data. I got the feeling reading it that he was influenced almost by anecdotes. The story of this not being able to fire anyone, or the tenure being granted after 15 months or something like that. That he just took that situation and was heavily influenced by that. I'm just curious, as you read it, did you feel?
Yeah, I think I would I would agree. And it feels to me like one of the issues with having folks making important decisions about education that don't really understand schools or teaching or learning or kind of the process of teaching and learning. And so for me, the political part is what evidence you attend to and what kind of evidence you attend to. That's a political decision to my mind. And the very fact, I mean, naming it as I'm not going to be political is kind of like saying I'm not looking at race. It's actually impossible to do. And that statement actually is worrisome for me in and of itself.
Can we talk a little bit about the ripple effects? You know, I live in New York, and we're talking about that decision there. What do you see going on nationally as a result of this particular decision, or where does it fit in what's going on in the general, what some would call a war on teachers? I'm just curious about your thoughts on the political, the bigger picture.
So I have sort of two, again, divergent opinions on that, which is going to be a theme, I think, of what I'm going to say here. You know, from a national perspective, I think it's a rather healthy conversation that has been started. I mean, reform of teacher employment protections of various sorts is something that ought to be on any good policy-making agenda, and I want to emphasize policy-making agenda, not necessarily litigation agenda. So I'm a little bit concerned about the roadshow being a litigation roadshow, but to the extent it sparked a very good conversation around how best to reform teacher employment policy, I think that's fantastic.
Has that happened? Where?
You know, I don't know. I read the media. You should tell me.
Because I have not heard of rational conversations about, well, how should we grant tenure?
But that is the difficult side of it. That's the difficult side. Within California, you know, at least for right now, the conversation has stopped. You know, to the extent there was any conversation going on, of course, the plaintiffs would argue there was no political conversation going on. But now we're really not going to see much conversation. So that seems to me you know, a risk of this kind of very divisive litigation.
I don't think there is no conversation going on. So I think there are maybe conversation has stopped between the people that we need to be having the conversation in terms of the union with the state and with the districts. Those are the people that have to be having this conversation, and I'm worried that this case has brought a level of antagonism to that conversation that's made it harder to have a productive one. But I think there are lots of points of evidence that tell us this has now become a popular conversation.
No doubt.
It may not be always rational, but it's still, for the first time, people are actually beginning to think, wait a second, what is the right thing we should be supporting in our schools and in our districts, and how should we be thinking about this? And there was a recent poll from PACE and USC that shows that the far plurality of respondents believes now that they should be thinking about the quality of teacher in their classroom and about tenure. So to me, this is actually very valuable because it's having people think about teachers in a way that we haven't traditionally thought about them and about the protections that we're affording teachers and what that does for students.
So you're finding that's a positive, you're saying?
I think it's a positive to have this be a public discussion.
I just think it's a troubling direction for the public discussion. I think that a conversation around teacher quality shouldn't be a conversation around teacher tenure necessarily. It shouldn't be a conversation around the accountability measures of teacher quality. That actually what we know about quality teaching is very different than the things that we measure in those kinds of studies. And so how do we reconcile that what's happening, to my mind, is the conversation around teaching quality, the quality of teaching, is getting hijacked by a particular mindset, a particular, you know, kind of minority of folks who think about teaching in a very mechanistic kind of way.
First of all, I don't think it's a minority of folks. And second, I don't think that it's people who think about it just mechanically. I think there's a wide range of things we should be talking about what makes a quality teacher. This is only a small part of it. And I think that it is too bad that this has kind of brought the focus solely to that part. But there has been a focus on teacher preparation programs in the last few years that has, you know, been kind of simmering there, that we should be having a discussion around about what do we do with teacher preparation programs? Can we be developing good teachers? Can we continue to train good teachers and help them develop over the course of their careers? These have to happen, but they can't happen without, you can't just cut off half the conversation and not have the other.
But has this decision and its focus hijacked the larger question about how we educate children? I mean, the subtitle of this is, will it make a difference for students? Yeah. But I mean, what I see is a real focus on, sometimes I think it may even be a setup Well, you know, if you want quality education, what you need is a quality teacher. As soon as you have, that's the only thing that matters is a quality teacher. And then when schools fail, you say, I guess you weren't quality.
Right.
And I wonder if this, maybe I'm getting jaded. I haven't been doing it for 40 years.
So I actually do worry that the litigation and the sort of hubbub that surrounds it has shifted the education reform conversation to a fairly narrow set of issues. And I'll let Katharine respond to this in a minute because we were talking about this outside, but it strikes me that it may or may not be a necessary condition for optimal reform for getting high quality teachers into the classroom, because I think all of us can agree that that's the most important school-based resource that's out there, but it's not the only school-based resource, and changing employment rules is not the only way to get high quality teachers into classrooms. We can talk about how you can, change the way that we reward and compensate teachers and compensate them better. How can we attract them and retain them in the hardest to serve areas? And, I don't want to numb people's minds with the statistics in California, but, on a cost-adjusted basis, we're still 49th out of 50 in terms of states and per pupil spending. We are in. The question is, do we lead with the reforms or do we lead with the resources? And
of course, California, I made a film about the history of California public schools called First to Worst that is now, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and I think the story is probably grimmer, but it's pretty clear that California chose to do it on the cheap. And so you have this bizarre situation of, I guess about half of the 1,000 school districts now have private foundations, and you have quasi-public-private. But the larger political, nationally, do you see this decision? Do you pick up effects of this decision? Philadelphia, they just voided the teacher union contract, just voided it. And I wonder, would that happen if this case were not in the mix?
look at Wisconsin, where the governor basically pushed through, at that time, Republican-controlled legislature, the abolition of public employee collective bargaining. That's a much greater move than just voiding a contract. So that was going on to some degree in some jurisdictions.
I read that the enrollment in teacher preparation programs is down significantly. I don't know if that's true at your institutions, but it's down 10% nationally between 2004 and 2012, and it's down, I think, 50% in California.
But what I think that signals to me is that this is why I feel like this particular conversation narrows in a way that's not productive for thinking about how we improve education, because part of what that's connected to for me are what are the conditions under which we're asking teachers to work. And that's not been enough a part of the conversation. What does it mean to work in a business, in an industry that is increasingly driven by these kind of accountability measures, increasingly driven by student test scores as the relatively sole measure of teaching quality? What does that mean for teachers? And I think those of us that study teachers, that study learning, that are in classrooms, hear and see that people are not only leaving the profession because of these pressures, but feel like they cannot do their best work under these conditions. They can't do the work creatively in the ways that they know kids need because there are all of these constraints around the work that they're doing. And so I think that has to be a part of this conversation around teacher quality, around recruiting people to the profession. What are we doing to the profession more broadly with the kinds of policies that we're enacting?
And are you saying that the Vergara, this whole case hurts that? Hurts teachers?
I'm saying it's a part of that. It's a part of a narrative around what matters for teaching being narrowed in a way that I find unproductive.
And what would you do? How would you get us out of this box?
Well, I think we need to be having a conversation around a better conversation around what good quality teaching looks like, and then a conversation around the ways in which the direction our educational policies have been driven in the past decade are moving us further away from high quality teaching and not closer to it.
Linda Darling-Hammond just joined us. Linda, I began by asking each of my panel if they supported the decision. I guess I should. So we know asked and answered, as the lawyers say. Were you surprised by the decision?
The lawyers I talked to had expected that this decision might go this way at the trial court level, given the way they saw the case unfold and the judge, et cetera. But I think there's a different view about what is likely to happen on appeal based on the law.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because the judge said we're going to wait for the appeal, but he also said that it was really up to the legislature to solve this problem. Do any of you expect that the California legislature will address this?
I don't know whether or not I would expect it to, but it would be something that might be prudent to the extent you want to keep policymaking out of the judiciary's hands. And the truth is, if you look at the specific statutes and what the judge actually overruled, or I should say struck down, these are eminently fixable problems by the legislature if they really did want to move in that direction. Now, question whether or not that conversation can be even had in this environment, whether or not any legislator would want to stick her neck out and have that conversation right at this point. But it might be a prudent thing to the extent they wanted to keep it out of the judiciary's hands.
What do you think will happen, Katharine?
I think we have an opportunity in California to lead on this. So I think our legislature should take this on and should work with the union, should work with the CSBA, should work with all the stakeholder groups to determine what are the right policies for our teachers and our students. And I think we have an opportunity to actually take a step back and say, no one wants to get rid of tenure. What is the right time limit for tenure? What is the right way to do due process? What is the right way to do layoffs? We could think about those things together as a group and come up with some better policies than what we have now without having to have this kind of antagonistic conversation.
That group would have to include the CTA. Would they come to
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if the CTA would come to the table, but I would hope that they would be willing to engage in a productive conversation. I may be Pollyanna-ish in thinking that, but...
Linda?
I was just saying, I think we have to think about what problem it is we're going to try to solve. If the problem is quality teaching in all schools, then the framework has to be a lot bigger than how many years till tenure or what is the LIFO process. Because ultimately, if you look at high-achieving countries, Korea, Finland, Singapore, and others, they put a lot on the front end. They train people really well. They pay for their preparation. It's free. Everyone gets it. Everyone meets a high bar for entry. And they don't worry a whole lot about evaluation for dismissal because they've done all of that work up front.
And of course, most countries use test scores to assess kids. We do
not
it to
teachers,
play
right.
gotcha, right?
Right, exactly. So if we really want to solve the problem of quality teaching in every school, then we have to step back. Even if you extend the time until tenure or due process from 2 years to 3, the districts that are not implementing a sound mentoring and evaluation system now will simply keep mediocre teachers in the classroom longer if we are bringing them in to begin with. Anyone who can't see an incompetent teacher within 2 years is incompetent themselves. I mean, it really does not take a long time to figure out who is grossly ineffective, I think was the words that were used. But it does take more time to take a teacher from beginning teacher status to a high level of effectiveness. There are judgment calls that happen, at the 2-year mark that might happen differently at the 3-year mark. A lot of superintendents say, if there's a question, I just get rid of that beginning teacher at the 2-year mark, rather than risk that they won't develop enough in the next year.
Well, that was
But for the places that say we can't get around to seeing our beginning teachers and we don't know who the failures are and we don't know what we're doing, those people are just going to stay in the classroom another year. So I think good evaluation systems, good mentoring systems, better preparation systems, better licensure are all part of the story that we have to look at.
But you're saying we need to be solving a different problem. But the problem on the table is those 3 statutes in Vergara. I mean, how likely is it that who's the stateswoman who is going to say, let's look at the big picture?
Well, I think the governor is very interested in taking that big picture look. And I think we will see from him in the coming year a lot of attention to the big picture questions of how are we bringing people in, how are we supporting them, how are we dealing with shortages, because in shortage areas you can't just fire the bad teacher if you think there is one. and expect that there'll be a good one to take their place. So all of those things, I think, have to be on the table, and I think we will see some leadership around it.
Is it true that in California that the poor kids get the worst teachers? Is that generally correct? So that you don't quarrel with that finding of fact?
I would say that some places that is true, and there are districts where, like Long Beach, for example, which is what our third largest system, 70% low-income kids, where they have developed a very strong teacher quality system from preparation through induction, and low-income kids are getting very high-quality teachers. In many places, it is disproportionately inexperienced and less well-trained teachers in high-need schools, but it doesn't always have to be that way, and some districts do it differently.
There is a successful, Long Beach is a great example of a successful system, but all the studies nationally and in California show that the low-income schools and students most often receive the lower quality teachers, and this has real effects on their achievement. So in reading, I think the estimate nationally is 4 weeks less instruction time equivalent in reading and 2 weeks in math. So when you put these low-income kids who need support with these less qualified teachers or less high-quality teachers, we are seeing real impacts on student achievement, and I agree with you. There are a whole plethora of policies that we should be addressing, not just these. But if we're going to start addressing some, and this is one on the table, there are ways we could make these better while we're still working on the other ones that you brought up.
I remember I asked Randy Weingarten, who's president of one of the two national unions, I suggested to her that this has to be the worst possible state for this case to come to trial, because on some level it's fundamentally indefensible to give tenure after less than 2 years. And she agreed. She said this, sort of wishing it almost had been any place else, because you have this perfect storm. That's why I wondered if you were surprised, because I watched some of the trial, and it just seemed like you couldn't possibly win. That can any of you defend giving tenure after 2 years?
Well, tenure for K-12 teachers is not tenure in the academy. In case there are people here from the university sector, where tenure is, kind of a lifetime commitment to employment. Tenure in the laws of California for teachers is due process rights. And in fact, in many states, beginning teachers have more due process rights than is true for beginning teachers in California, because the grand bargain that was made decades ago was no due process rights for the first 2 years. So you could be fired at will on any moment, at any day, for any reason or no reason at all. I don't like the way you raised your eyebrow, you're out of here.
Or I have a friend, I want to get a job.
And frankly, in the private sector, and in most of government, you have at-will employment for no more than 6 months. My university and many other places, you have a 6-month period in which you can act with impunity to fire somebody for no cause without making a case. So the 2 years that exist for California teachers, and again in other states, there's more due process for beginning teachers than there is here, is a long time to go without any barrier to dismissal. So I think the real question is, can you defend the evaluation processes and the mentoring and induction processes and all the other things that are going on there? I would not be distressed if there were 3 years till tenure or 2 years till tenure or whatever it is. But the real question is not the amount of time. The real question is what goes on during that amount of time, whether it's 6 months or 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is.
So the question is kind of interesting to me, because can you defend tenure? Well, that's a really good policy question, right? And the 2 years to tenure period, that's a good policy question that we could have, and maybe there's a better way to do it, maybe giving another year or so with intensive coaching and mentoring and the like to allow teachers to perform better, and it might be good for everybody all the way around. But the different question is, can you defend the case overall? Because again, when you take these very minute educational policies and you litigate around those educational policies, I want to see a lot more in terms of how these policies are affecting that fundamental right to an education in terms of the judge's decision. Is tenure alone enough? Is it somehow the combination of these things? Because as far as I'm concerned, and I'm a lawyer and happy, and I represent poor kids all the time, I'm happy to have a principle out there that my favorite policy reform du jour can be the opportunity for litigation, so long as we don't have to get too much into the nitty-gritty of how individuals or groups of children are harmed in these things. If there is a policy out there that might be subject to criticism, we could have a good policy discussion around it, but having it be brought as a court case, can you defend a tenure, is kind of a different question.
Can you defend last in, first out as the decision rule? Yeah.
So that case has been litigated not only, of course, here in Vergara. It was litigated in the Reed case in Los Angeles, and it focused on 3 middle schools, and it was indefensible. There was the last in, first out policy had the effect of incredible teacher turnover in those schools, and we do know that teacher turnover is something that has a pretty clear and causal effect on poor performance for students. So again, can't defend it on that application for sure. There's no way you could do it.
Okay. Maybe Linda can. Yeah. Can you defend it? Last in, first
Well,
out?
I can offer what is the rationale that I think has some merit, which is that if you're going to do massive layoffs, which is the context that's painted for that, then is there a rational basis on which to make those massive layoffs? And there's quite a bit of evidence that experience does make a difference in teacher effectiveness. And while it's not a perfect relationship...
But the statute doesn't say, in the case of massive layoffs, we'll do LIFO. It says LIFO. Right. So that's what I'm asking you to defend.
Layoffs, as opposed to dismissal for cause, right, happen in a context where you have the need to reduce the teaching force. So what I'm saying is there could be other factors, and there are. Many districts actually do apply other factors besides seniority now in California, and I think it's appropriate that there be other factors that could be considered in addition to seniority. But seniority is not entirely irrational as a way to manage a large scale.
Can I jump in on that one actually
please.
for a second? So I've been studying last in, first out, and I've been studying sort of the impacts of layoffs and RIFs, which are what precedes layoffs, right? So you get a RIF notice first, and then in California by March 15th, you have to tell a teacher if they might be laid off. That's a RIF notice. And then the far majority of those teachers, or in many districts about half to 3/4 of them, then have that RIF rescinded. So there's 2 months when they don't know if they're going to get let go. And a lot of them start looking for jobs in other districts nearby.
And get them.
Especially the very marketable ones like the special ed, STEM teachers who are in shortage areas. And so this is really harmful and causes quite a bit of churn. And sometimes those are junior teachers who should be kept and don't know if they're going to get kept. And then when they're finally told, well, we're going to keep you because we made this exception for you, it's too late. They've got another job. And so this, I think, is very hard to get behind. And secondly, we see studies in New York City and Washington that show that the way that last in, first out layoffs happen, it lays off way more teachers because inexperienced teachers are cheaper, right? And so you end up laying off more teachers and you create more of this churn inside the system. In addition, if you're using VAM as an indicator, which I understand not everyone wants to do or thinks is a good measure, if you do use one of the many measures of teacher effectiveness, you see during the last in, first out layoff that way more effective teachers are laid off than if you do it by a different measure. And in New York City, they show that based on teacher observation measures of quality, not even VAMs, if they were to simulate a last in, first out layoff versus an effectiveness-based layoff using solely observation measures, every single person who gets laid off in a LIFO-based layoff would not be laid off in an effectiveness-based layoff. Or not, that's not true. Almost every single person who got laid off in an effectiveness-based layoff, so 2.5% of teachers would not get laid off under LIFO. And so this is really problematic in the distribution of effectiveness for kids.
You know, when you look at the system, you talk about the massive pink slips, it's hard to imagine a more dysfunctional way of doing business. And when Linda brings in other countries, that would be useful for us to think about it. But I wonder in the political climate if we are so polarized, and it does seem to be very narrowly focused on teachers, is it at all possible to have, and we can have an academic conversation, but are there any politicians who, you said you think Jerry Brown might be willing to do that? I mean, that sounds like a thin thread.
I've been with other people in conversations with the governor and others in the legislature who are very interested in changing the framework that we've had in California, which is basically not handling the teaching force issues at all. I mean, basically, this is one piece of this much bigger whole. And it would be, I think the LCFF formula brings the possibility that we now could have more equitable funding bases. A lot of the problems with churn of beginning teachers in high-need districts has been because they don't pay enough in salaries, their working conditions are poorer, they can't recruit and retain teachers in an effective way. And that piece of it may begin to solve a part of the foundational problem. The other piece we have to solve is that right now we don't have a system in which you can count on every teacher who comes into the system through the credentialing pathways to be well prepared to do the job that they're going to be hired to do. And I do sit as the chair of the CTC, so I have a little interest in that part of it. And we're undertaking major revision of the accreditation system, major revision of the licensure system. What we need to add to that is so that we can ensure that that doesn't provoke more shortages with then dysfunctional responses is the kind of funding for candidates to go through preparation, which is routine in other countries, and the other incentives to be sure that people get to the places we need them.
Are you saying we need to make it harder to become a teacher? Raise the bar?
Easier to be a teacher and harder to become a
yeah.
teacher, in the sense that, but I don't know if it's harder to become a teacher. If you go through a good preparation program, it should be harder to be a preparation program, number one. Because I think that's part of the issue. I mean, if you're going to bring people into the profession, we do have a lot of gateways and barriers for people to come into teaching already. We have 4 tests they have to pass. There's to be in the CSU system, you have to be in the top third of candidates in the state, et cetera. It's not that all of the teachers coming in are coming from the bottom of some pool, but they're not all getting high quality preparation to teach the kids who are there in our classrooms to the new challenging standards. And so it should be a real challenge to preparation programs that they are preparing people well. And that may not make it harder to become a teacher, but it will certainly make it easier to be a teacher. I do also think there has to be a high bar for entry around performance assessments, and California is the first state to really put that policy in place.
I want to go back to the trial and the implications. The judge heard a lot of testimony about value-added measurements and apparently relied pretty heavily on Tom Kane, on the 2 professors. And since then, more studies have come out questioning value-added, the reliability of value-added. When this case comes back up, will it be considerably different? Will the court pay less attention to these supposedly precise measurements of what a good teacher, how much money you can add, and so on? Has that been?
Well, the evidence is in, so the appeals court cannot introduce new evidence. So new studies will not be introduced, but they will have to balance their decision on the law.
That evidence cannot be introduced? I'm not a lawyer.
Well,
that's
Not anymore. So in
We'll let
that's
Bill
what my
answer.
question, when you ask the question, when this case comes up again, are you talking about a new case
no, the
involving
appeal.
teacher
No,
quality?
no, the appeal.
No, the evidence is in on the appeal. This is, I mean, I can imagine at some point amicus briefs being added to the mix from folks who are academic researchers talking about the stability or non-stability of value-added models and that sort of thing. So you can get that in through non-evidentiary channels, but at the end of the day, the heart and soul, the guts of the decision has to be made on the evidence that's there.
But even if we could add new evidence, and I think there is a lot of new evidence coming out about VAMs, I don't think anybody up there was saying, that I know of, none of these economists are saying this should be the only measure of teacher effectiveness that's used in these models. People are in these evaluation systems or anything else. They're saying this should be one of many, including observation-based measures, which I think we know very little about. And we're hoping that when you combine these different measures, we can get a good read on what is a quality teacher, and we're still developing these. And then we could use those to help inform these policies as we start to make them.
Naila, you're being very quiet about all this. What are you reacting when you...
I guess I think for me, this is a very small piece of a very large conversation. And so what I find frustrating about this historical moment that we're in with respect to the ways in which we engage the conversation about education is that narrowness. So whether or not the value-added models measure teacher effectiveness well, whether they don't, that's an important conversation to have. And yet, we're in a moment where schools in California are very poorly funded, where the studies of teaching and learning, which are very different than the studies of these kind of teaching effectiveness. So, like, I'm a learning scientist, right? So I study the nature of teaching and learning. Those studies are actually, there's an incredible disjuncture between the research that looks at issues of teaching and learning and what high-quality teaching looks like and what optimal learning environments look and feel like for kids, and the research that was a part of the evidence for this case. And I think that disjuncture is really troubling for me.
Well, I mean, again, that's what's fascinating to me is the politics of this. It seems as if it fits into a larger agenda, which is going after public education generally. But I want to bring it back to California and this election, because whoever wins, what happens if Marshall Tuck wins? As California superintendent? I mean, a lot of. You look at the money that's flowing in. There's a lot of money coming from out of state. What will happen if he wins, Linda?
I don't know Marshall Tuck, so I really can't answer that question.
Anybody willing to speculate? Do you expect, does he have a chance? There are a lot of people paying attention to this outside of California, as you know.
I think right now we don't know who's going to win, which is interesting since Tolkien's the incumbent. So I think that he does have a chance. Tuck has a chance.
I don't know whether or not he's going to win, and I'm not sure what will happen afterwards, but there are those who view the election as a referendum on the so-called reform agenda. There's no question about that, and that not only includes how we look at teacher employment protections, but also charters and choice and a whole range of things that are somehow connected with the reform agenda. And you know, the way it's being pitched in, again, the media is the sort of old school unionist versus the reformer. And it's pretty hard not to think that the public is not absorbing that message, and the public will likely vote along those lines. So, at a minimum, I think this will say something about the popularity of the reform agenda.
It's interesting how that word reform.
Yeah, I know. I went like that.
Yeah, right, exactly. and the people who are concerned. What about the Time magazine cover and article? Have many of you seen that Time magazine? What was your reaction to that? Oh, come on. I mean, some years back, Time magazine put Michelle Rhee on the cover with a broom and arguably catapulted her into the ranks of the nation's premier education reformer, although I helped her also a little bit by covering her in the NewsHour. But
I'll offer one observation about that. If you didn't see the Time magazine cover, I think it said something about rotten apples or something like that. It was another
and it has a
kind of
judicial hammer coming down on. Well, there we have it right there.
So we got it.
It looks like it's about to hit a good apple. Yeah.
And that's part of the policy problem right there, is that when we engage as a society in teacher bashing, a lot of good people don't come into the profession and leave the profession because they say, I don't want to be, in a situation where I'm just going to be, unfairly treated. So I think that's, part of the question. I will say the first thing that I thought of when I became aware of the cover was a kind of feeling of guilt, because many years ago I was the director of something called the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future. And in 1996, we made the case, Governor Jim Hunt chaired the commission, that teaching really mattered. What matters most? Teaching for America's future. And we had a set of recommendations about how to get and keep and train good teachers. Well, the notion that teachers are the whole ball game is now kind of the discourse. And I think that's really problematic because, particularly for teachers who teach in high-need communities with students who are increasingly in severe poverty, with a more and more tattered safety net, in communities that are more and more segregated, in unequally funded, even more unequally funded schooling systems than we had many years ago. When you look at studies like those that Don Brewer and Rick Kaniszek and others have done to sort of calculate the influences on student achievement, you almost always come out with something like 60% of the variation in student achievement is still in this country, pretty much determined by socioeconomic factors, which are correlated with how we under-resource the schools and, et cetera, et cetera. And all those things come together. And somewhere between 7 and 10% of the influence on student achievement could be attributed to teachers. And, there's some portion of it that's also curriculum and school leaders and other factors in the school. And we're way out of balance now in the society in treating the main effects on student achievement, the resources kids need to have to learn before they come to school, when they're in school, that teachers have to work with when they're working with kids, and putting all of the onus right now on teachers, and particularly demonizing the teachers who work in the highest need communities, including those who are doing a very good job. And one interesting finding about that is that if you look at the differential between affluent and poor kids at 9th grade in achievement, some research suggests that about a third of that is present before kindergarten because of the differences in what they've experienced before then, and about 2/3 occurs during the summertime because affluent kids move ahead in their achievement as they get great learning opportunities. Poor kids fall behind. And during the school year, the kids move pretty much on parallel slopes in their learning, with low-income kids actually gaining a little. That's the result of schools helping kids continue to learn. And we're not dealing with these big issues while we're kind of creating
But what you're suggesting, though, is that, you said feel a little bit of guilt that
I was out there saying teaching matters most.
Yeah.
And it does matter, of course, but it doesn't. That's all else equal. If all else is equal, teaching matters a lot. But all else is not equal. And putting all the onus on teaching is preventing us from solving the bigger problems.
There are people who argue that this is actually almost a conspiracy, that folks on the right are saying what you need is a good teacher. That's the most important thing. If you have a good teacher, everything will be fine. And then, of course, when it is not fine, you then can blame the teachers. Do you subscribe to that? Does that make sense, that logic? I don't know, I'm not saying, do you think that is what's going on?
I think the discourse can absolutely lead you to that kind of a framework.
Some people want to put you on the spot. Can we separate public education from politics?
I teach a whole course on it.
Yeah.
And if we could separate them, she wouldn't have a course.
Exactly. No, I don't think you can. I think the ideal of this, public education being not political is completely false, and it's always been false. You have an elected school board.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a political thing, and this is an important. Every person will say in a poll, education is the most important thing to me. But to Linda's point, they don't actually fund that, right? And they don't actually support that with how they are willing to pay taxes in the proposition system in California. We've seen that. And so I do think that Linda's correct. There's a whole set of things that we need to do that are far more important than just the teacher. But once you have to think about what can we do inside the schools, and Linda, your own work shows this, it is the teacher that matters inside the schools, and the governance structure is going to be inherently political, and we can't really get rid of that.
But as Linda said, you have to make it easier to be a teacher. Now, there was an effort to separate politics, and so they would hold the school board elections separate, completely separate. And what happened was they were dominated by political self-interest. I'm assuming you all agree you cannot separate. So, and then to also put you on the spot, your own definition of a quality teacher. And I'm going to start with you.
Oh, good heavens. I'm not sure I could give you a fulsome definition of what a quality teacher is, but I can say that we shouldn't be evaluating teachers on single measures.
Okay.
And obviously
So you
test scores.
cannot define them just by the kids' test scores.
Right,
Okay.
right. And there's a lot of work on that front. I'll let the people who actually do that work answer the question.
A quality teacher, in your definition.
Yeah, I would say a quality teacher is a teacher who's able to engage kids around important disciplinary concepts and support their learning of those concepts towards being educated citizens.
I love that definition, but I think we ask teachers to do a lot more than that. I mean, the first word that came to my mind when you said what's a quality teacher is superhuman. And I think this is a great definition, but you also have to think about the emotional aspect of the kid inside your classroom because they're dealing with poverty or anything else and how you interact with parents and community members. And so I think being a quality teacher is incredibly hard, and I don't think you just know one when you see one. I don't think that's true.
Linda?
Well, to piggyback on what Katharine just said, I think somebody who really understands the content and how to teach the content, but also understands the child and the child's development and how to really support the engagement and effort and motivation and success of the child. It shouldn't be that we need to have superhumans, obviously, and that has been increasingly the case in California where we've been stripping the other resources away out of schools. Hopefully that's going to begin to turn around. Ordinary human beings have to be able to do it. I think they have to, though, be extremely well prepared. And it is simply not true that teachers are born and not made.
Yeah.
You can make good teachers, and they appreciate it when they have access to the knowledge and the tools that will allow them to be successful. So I think that the primary thing that the society needs to do is make it possible for people to get that kind of training.
I tend to reduce it to sort of a bumper sticker mentality. There's a group which says the problem with education is we need better people. We need to get rid of a lot of the teachers we have and bring in better people. And then there are other folks who say, no, you need to make it a better job. We have an awful lot of good people in the classroom. We need to make a better job, make it easier to be teachers. But the quality definition is a tough one. Another question, and this would go to your major universities. Linda and I have had a conversation more than once about how some colleges and universities use teacher training as a kind of cash cow. They take money from, but they don't spend money on the training. They spend it instead on training doctors and nurses and lawyers. So how would do you feel that the major universities here in California, and that would be yours, do they do enough? Do they do enough to improve teacher training across the state? And you can say that you do, but they don't. Linda.
Well, I think the universities like Berkeley, Stanford, and others are doing top-flight training of teachers themselves, and in some cases are also training the doctoral students will become the teacher and faculty elsewhere. And I think we do have some really high-quality places in the state doing that. The issue always is, whether you can raise the floor on teacher training. And to your point, places that are training teachers well are not making money on teachers. To do it well, it's going the other way. I don't want to say you're losing money on teachers. You never lose on teachers, but it is a very costly thing. And part of the reason accreditation is important and having a much more powerful accreditation tool is that in the university, the law school dean comes to the president and the medical school dean comes to the president and they say, I need to do this, this, and this, or I can't be accredited. And the education school dean typically goes to the president and says, please, sir, like Oliver Twist, may I have some more gruel? And it's not unless you have really serious accreditation standards, there's not enough of a lever to ensure that the quality of training, supervision, clinical practice, which is very expensive, but the clinical portion is going to be there.
Any other, on the role of the major universities in improving teacher training in the Cal States, et cetera? Are you doing enough?
Well, let me just say there's some great places in the Cal State system as well. We shouldn't assume that there's an automatic sort of hierarchy of teacher education quality there.
A question comes up of I'm paraphrasing it and rewriting it slightly, but has this decision been a wake-up call for individual school districts? Have they, if any school districts that you know of, said, hey, wait a minute, maybe we are sending our least qualified teachers down to the schools that have the neediest kids, and changed their ways? Has it been soul-searching?
There has been in some districts. And I mentioned Long Beach before. San Francisco is a place that has not done as much yet, but has done a lot of soul searching. Yeah. And there, are other places that have really worried about it. What, though, has happened historically is that the parents with the clout, advocate for the schools where, for the resources for the schools where their kids go to school. And historically, the schools that are less good places to teach with less good materials, supplies, equipment, facilities, et cetera, end up the places with beginning teachers, under-supported who churn.
But I think we need to remember this is not just about parents or the district. There's a partner in this, right, which is the union. And these things are dictated by the collective bargaining agreements and in terms of how teachers are allowed to move throughout the system. And Bill's done some work on this. There's sort of an open empirical question right now on what do the things that we put into our bargaining agreements that are actually the policy about how we can put teachers into low-income classrooms and other classrooms around the district, do those exacerbate or facilitate the reduction of achievement gaps that happen qualification gaps in our teachers? And so we've documented in California that we do see the sort of, however you want to define lower qualified teachers inside these low-income schools and classrooms. So the question now is, can we reform the contracts with partnerships with the union and the district to help redistribute teachers in ways that would improve that? And Bill probably knows.
Well, I'll just add to that the teacher assignment rules and the collective bargaining agreements might be part of the equation, particularly in large bureaucratized school districts. But the other piece of this really is how do we incentivize teachers to teach in those? And so the contract is a part of that. Do we have to revisit things like the step and column salary schedule to see whether or not we can create incentives for teachers to teach in hard-to-staff schools and the like? But the other part of that really just is, again, going back to this, what I'm hearing as a recurring theme over and over again, how do we create the conditions in these schools for teachers to want to be there? Because ultimately, senior teachers are going to teach where they want to teach.
And every district that I know of that has made investments in high-need schools with low-income students to put fantastic curriculum and programs there, small enough class sizes, good working conditions, has ended up with surpluses of teachers in those schools. It's not the kids that the teachers are running away from. It's the conditions that have been allowed to essentially be the equivalent of what Gloria Latza-Billings calls aggressive neglect in some of those schools.
Extra pay?
Well, teachers typically don't respond as much to extra pay. There's a lot of studies of bonus pay, as much as $18,000, $20,000 to combat pay to get teachers into high-need schools. But what teachers do respond to is a good principal, a strong curriculum, excellent colleagues, and time and again in inner-city communities where those ingredients are put in place with the resources and so on, you find excellent teachers will come and stay and become bonded as a career-long unit in that community. It's very rare, however, that the conditions are put in place in those communities because they're the communities where there's usually the least squeaky wheel.
That's the leadership issue.
I'll just add, so here's a nice thought experiment. I've had a conversation with very prominent educational economists over the years about what should come first, reform of the rules, collective bargaining rules and the like, or the resources and to support the conditions, right? So on some level, maybe it is a sequencing conversation, or maybe we do need to reform the rules first and put the money in later. Maybe we need to put the money in first before we can talk about reform of the rules. Here's the thought experiment. I'm wondering if anybody who would support the reform of the rules as the solution would take the bet, okay, if we do that, if we give you, carte blanche to think about the best way to do teacher assignment policies and teacher retention policies and the like, and the contract rules, and if it doesn't move the dial appreciably on distribution of teachers so that low-income kids, poor-performing kids are getting high-quality teachers, or if it doesn't move the dial more generally on student performance after, say, 5 years or something like that, then will you support us on the money side of the ledger, right? That would be a good bet to take.
My reaction to that would be to tell those people to go to places where it's happening.
Yeah.
Places where leadership has stepped up and you can see that it isn't.
Then, well, if you want to take that as a proven, that's fine. I would support that, but I'm not sure that.
You folks can see that an hour is certainly not enough. We're just getting started, and we have to end. But let me ask you can you argue that in any way this decision is an opportunity? I mean, there've been huge negative, this is awful, et cetera, et cetera. Can you argue that this decision represents an opportunity for people like you who want to improve the system, and if so, how?
Well, it's an opportunity to open up this kind of conversation, which I think is very productive, and to allow people to say, well, what really is the set of things that we need to do to have high-quality teaching in every school? And to the extent that where the lawsuit started is a small piece of that, fine. But the most important thing is to open up the real powerful elements that need to be addressed.
Opportunity for conversation.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think this is a huge opportunity for conversation, and I think it's good that the public is beginning to engage in the conversation as well as, and maybe perhaps start to vote in terms of this conversation. And so I agree, there should be a whole level, a spectrum of things that we're talking about, not just these small policies, but I think California, again, I think we could lead the country in this if we thought hard about it and collaborated together.
Ayla?
I would agree as well. I think it's also an opportunity to think about the assumptions that we bring to the conversation and the way that we think about data and the kinds of data we consider as we talk about what high quality teaching is and what we need to do to get there.
We need to lower the temperature, though.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. I think this conversation sort of exemplifies that. I think the decision itself presents an opportunity for thinking about how quality of education is something that is a moral mandate, a constitutional mandate perhaps. I like that a lot from the decision as we started this conversation. And we'll see whether or not we get leadership at the policy level. We are having this conversation at the public dialogue level, and that's a pretty good thing.
I appreciate that. Would you give it up for my panel, please? Thank you guys.